Okay, let's get started. We are doing strength and questions today. I am going to let's talk first about how to strengthen an argument. One thing to keep in mind with strength and questions is that they are probably the most common type of critical reasoning question. So you will get lots of practice on them, and it's good to really understand how they work and what to expect so that you know what to look for. So, here are the 5 most common templates for correct answers to strengthen questions. The first is to explicitly state an assumption that the argument relies on. A lot of times students ask what the difference is. Here is the difference. A correct answer in an assumption question can be a correct answer in a strengthen question. All correct answers on assumption questions do strengthen the argument, but all strengthen answers do not necessarily they're not a necessary assumption automatically. So, kind of a square rectangle thing there. Address a potential issue that could affect the conclusion validity. So, ruling out some malicious variable that the author failed to consider. Provide an additional premise that supports the conclusion. This one is very popular on shorter arguments that are just like, here's a background sentence, here's a conclusion, and the author doesn't really do much to support their conclusion. I call them jump conclusions. So whenever you read a really short argument, it is worth it to be on the lookout for some actual support. Explicitly rule out an alternative cause in a cause and effect argument, similar to point 2, just taking a malicious variable or a potential malicious variable and saying that's not going on here. Or confirm a conclusion by adding, altering, or eliminating some variable. So showing, for instance, in a cause and effect argument that the effect doesn't happen when the cause doesn't happen, something like that. So those are the kind of answers we are looking for in these questions. We are going to work through some examples like we usually do. I am going to give you some time for each one to work through it, and then we will discuss it. And then if you have general questions, we will have time at the end. If you have questions about the examples, feel free to chime in and we can discuss them. Here is our first one, and I will send out the poll. Okay. Resveratrol. Resveratrol, a substance found in red wine, has long been suspected to have longevity enhancing properties. In fact, in a recent study, scientists compared the average lifespans of people in Mediterranean countries, where red wine is consumed regularly, to the lifespans of people in Scandinavian countries, where red wine is consumed significantly less regularly. It was determined that people in the Mediterranean countries lived, on average, 7 years longer than people living in the Scandinavian countries lived. Thus, the scientists concluded that the increased intake of resveratrol explains the differences in longevity. We are trying to strengthen. Let's look at our breakdown. So, resveratrol has long been suspected to have longevity enhancing effects, and it is found in red wine. Here is a study where we compare the lifespans of people in Mediterranean countries, they're big red wine drinkers, to the lifespans of people in Scandinavian countries where they are not such red wine drinkers, and found that those in Mediterranean countries lived an average of 7 years longer. Conclusion: the cause is the increase in resveratrol consumption, and the difference is that they live longer. Let's look at our choices. A. Because red wine is fermented with grape skins for longer than white wine is, red wine contains more resveratrol than white wine contains. We aren't really talking about white wine at all, I don't believe. So, that gives us an explanation that we do not need. B, another study found that people in the Mediterranean countries also lived longer on average than people in some countries in South America did. We are not talking about South America, so that's also a bit off topic. C, people living in Mediterranean countries drink red wine about 3 times as often as people living in Scandinavian countries do. This is an explanation trap. So, what this is doing is saying, like, these people in the Mediterranean countries drink way more red wine than the people in the Scandinavian countries do. But we already know that. That is the premise. People in the Mediterranean countries where red wine is consumed regularly, and we're comparing their lifespans to people in Scandinavian countries where red wine is consumed significantly less regularly. So all C is doing is giving us more information on something that we are already trusting to be true. D, people living in Scandinavian countries do not eat, on average, more meat, eggs, and dairy, which are known to cause health problems than people in Mediterranean countries eat. This choice is ruling out a potential other cause for the difference in longevity, and so it is strengthening the cause and effect relationship in that way. It's saying, hey, it could have been this other thing, but in this case it's not. We're ruling it out, thus our cause is more likely. And E, people living in the Mediterranean countries do not engage in walking, which is associated with an increase in longevity less each day than do people living in Scandinavian countries. So they could this one I think is like a direction trap. It goes in the wrong direction. So if the people in the Mediterranean countries walked more than the people in the Scandinavian countries, then that could weaken the argument. If they walk the same amount, then it doesn't really do anything. All this says is that they do not walk less than people living in the Scandinavian countries, so it's not really helpful for us. It definitely does not strengthen the argument. Our best choice, I believe, is D. All right. Any questions about that one? Here is our next one. This one, I believe, is a medium, and the previous one is a medium, and then the later ones are going to be hard difficulty. D and E on the last one are similar, but D goes in the direction that we need to rule out an alternative cause, and E goes in the wrong direction, so it does not rule out an alternative cause. Okay. If a dancer's feet are not well suited to dancing on point, it can be difficult for the dancer to perform ballet at the professional level. As a result, many aspiring ballet dancers have quit because their feet are not well suited to dancing on point. However, the bar company now produces innovative shoes that dancers with almost any type of feet can use to dance on point with relative ease. Clearly, therefore, the number of people with successful careers in ballet will increase. So, if a dancer's feet aren't well suited to dancing on point, it's hard for them to perform ballet at a professional level. So, many aspiring dancers have to quit if they don't have the right feet situation. But now, this company is producing shoes that help dancers who previously could not dance on point do so with relative ease. And the conclusion is that the number of people with successful careers in ballet will increase. A. Some dancers with feet not well suited to dancing on point have had successful careers in ballet without using the innovative shoes produced by the bar company. That isn't very helpful. The fact that a handful of people have had successful careers despite their unfortunate foot situation doesn't mean that this development won't lead to an increase in the number of people with successful ballet careers. There are skills other than skill at dancing on point that a dancer must have to perform ballet at the professional level, certainly, but the argument kind of lays it out as if the shoes or not being able to dance on point is the reason that people are quitting, so that's not very helpful either. C, an initiative underway to provide more funding for the arts is expected to result in an increase in the number of ballet companies operating. So, this means that there will be jobs available for all of these dancers that have the shoes and can now pursue professional ballet careers, which is a pretty important component of the number of people with successful careers in ballet will increase. If there are no more positions, then that will not happen. So, C fills in the other part of this. Yes, we have dancers that can dance better, but do they have positions available? C is answering that for us. D, dancing on point at the professional level requires years of training. Kind of similar to B, there's no reason to think that people aren't putting in the hours to train. It's mostly talking about how, depending on how your feet are shaped, you can or cannot do this well. And E, there are types of dance that are done professionally that do not involve dancing on point. We are not concerned with other types of dance, only ballet. So I'm thinking C. Any questions on that one? Oh, yes. You can just, yeah, the thing with assumptions is that they can be lots of things. They can be subtle, they can be obvious. Every argument has a ton of them, but only a couple probably matter. There is a lot that goes on with assumptions, and it can be hard to look at the argument and find the ones that you need to focus on. But as you look at more arguments, there's definitely kind of patterns that emerge. Did someone else have a question? I don't think that it lets me unmute you or you unmute yourself. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. That would be great. Why is it not B? So we're trying to strengthen the argument. I think B is just kind of off topic, but if you feel like it's on topic, then it would only lean towards weakening the argument because it's saying there's other skills that a dancer might require to perform ballet at the professional level that maybe the shoes won't fix. So there might be like more barriers than just the shoes. So if anything, B might weaken the argument. I think it's a little bit off topic, but either way, it does not strengthen. Doesn't A prove that the dancers who quit were actually legitimate to be professional dancers, so the shoes will help more become professional? The problem with A is it's talking about some dancers were able to pursue successful careers in ballet without using the shoes, but some dancers is just that is not a specific amount. That could be like one dancer. That could be like two dancers in all of the world. So the fact that two people were able to swing it without the help of the shoes doesn't mean much. It could also be a lot of people, but we don't know that because some is a very vague amount of people. And so that is why A isn't really helpful. The fact that some amount of people did this thing is just not enough information for us to strengthen the conclusion. Okay, let's look at our next one. Yes, it will be recorded. Okay. Unlike most other fish, sharks travel in a pattern that involves first swimming at an upward angle and then coasting at a downward angle. Sharks, unlike most other fish, are always denser than the water in which they swim and therefore sink when they are not actively swimming. Marine biologists believe that this fact is the reason why sharks travel differently from other fish. So, sharks swim in this weird way. They swim upward and then they sort of like coast downward. Sharks are also always denser than the water in which they swim. And therefore, if they are not actively swimming, they just sink like a rock. So the conclusion is that the marine biologists think the density of sharks relative to water is why sharks swim in this unusual way. A. When sharks rest by pumping their gills rather than swimming, they settle onto the seafloor. We already know that they sink when they aren't actively swimming, so this just explains our premise in a way that is not helpful to us. Seals, which become denser as they go deeper into the ocean, switch from swimming horizontally near the ocean's surface to swimming upward and coasting downward when they are deep underwater. So, sharks are always more dense than the water in which they swim. Seals are sometimes more dense than the water in which they swim. Sometimes they're less dense. So when they are less dense, they swim, a normal way, just kind of flat. But when they are deep underwater and they're more dense than the water in which they're swimming, they swim like sharks do. This gives us an example of when the proposed cause, density, is present, the proposed effect occurs, and when the proposed cause, relative density, is not present, the proposed effect does not occur. So B is looking pretty good. C, many types of fish have internal mechanisms that enable them to match the density of their bodies to the density of the surrounding water. That's great for those fish, but we are only talking about sharks here and their density, and so these fish that are matching the density of the water, that's off topic. D, certain types of birds travel in a pattern that involves flying at an upward angle and then coasting at a downward angle. I like this question because it has a good comparison with the seals, and then it has this bird comparison that is just useless. This doesn't have anything to do with relative density to water. It just says they also fly this way, which is just not the whole equation. So this bird comparison is an invalid comparison. And E, when non-shark fish use internal mechanisms to adjust their density to make it greater than that of the surrounding water, they sink deeper into the water. I feel like this is supposed to tempt you a little bit, but that's just how density works. If you are more dense to the liquid in which you are submerged, you will sink in the liquid. So this is just like an example of density functioning as it does. So the best choice here, I'm thinking, is B. Yeah, a lot of these will just be like stating a fact in a way that isn't relevant to the argument. And we really need our facts to do some work. We really need them to strengthen the conclusion. So if they don't, it's not really helping us in the way we need it to. So yes, B works because it gives us an example of one critter who is sometimes like a shark and sometimes not like a shark, and when they are dense like a shark, they swim like a shark. All right. Any question on that? Okay, here's our next one. The conclusion makes a comparison of sharks to other fish. How does B fit into this? So it's because sharks are used as an example of this unusual swimming pattern, and the marine biologists think that one thing that sharks have that other fish don't is that they are always denser than the water that they're swimming in. Seals are sometimes denser than the water they're swimming in, and when they are, they swim the same way that sharks do. So since the marine biologists think that the cause is relative density being denser than the water you are swimming in, and the effect is this unusual swimming pattern, and seals exhibit the same swimming pattern when the cause is present, when they are denser than the water they're swimming in, it strengthens the argument that way. Okay. In a recent college admission scandal, wealthy parents, in addition to parents with average incomes, were accused of bribing universities in order to secure admission for their children. When the cases went to trial, the number of parents with average incomes who were convicted of charges was much greater than the number of wealthy parents convicted. Clearly, being wealthy confers an advantage to criminal defendants in court. Let's. So, in a recent admission scandal, there's these two types of parents, wealthy parents and average income parents, that were accused of bribing universities to get their children admitted. When the cases went to trial, the number of average income parents who were convicted was much greater than the number of wealthy parents convicted. Thus, being wealthy confers an advantage to criminal defendants in court. Let's go through our choices. A. Many public defense attorneys who defend those accused of crimes at no cost to the accused rank among the top 5% of all law school graduates. This feels relevant, but it is not. We only know that the number of average income parents that were convicted was higher than the number of wealthy parents convicted. So whether their lawyers are top 5% or not doesn't matter if they were convicted. It's adjacent but irrelevant information. B, wealthy parents accused of crimes are significantly more likely to be mentioned in news media than are parents with average incomes who are accused of crimes. I also feel that this is irrelevant. It could be spun as weakening the argument as well. It definitely does not strengthen the argument. C, of the wealthy parents accused of bribing universities, the fraction who had actually bribed universities was equal to the fraction of the accused parents with average incomes who actually had. So, what this is saying is in these two groups, the fraction of people who bribed universities, who actually bribed the universities, was the same in each. So, the problem with this is that we are talking about numbers. If there were 10 wealthy parents accused and four of them actually bribed the universities, that would be 4 out of 10. And if there were 100 average income parents accused and 40% or 40 of them actually bribed the universities, that would also be 4 out of 10. But it would not be so surprising that more average income parents had been convicted if there's 10 times as many average income parents being accused. It could just be a numbers game. So while C feels helpful, we're talking about numbers and it's talking about fractions. And without knowing that the groups are similar in size, it just doesn't quite strengthen our conclusion. D. On average, the wealthy parents paid about $327,000 in defense attorneys' fees, whereas the parents with average incomes paid approximately $76,000. So, this is an interesting thing that comes up a lot on the GMAT. It'll be like, oh, people paid a lot. Look at this difference. Look at how much more they paid. But we would already probably assume that the wealthy parents paid more for defense than the average income parents because they have more money. This doesn't, and it seems like, that if you paid more money, you would be able to get better defense, but that is a step too far. We don't know that for sure. I'm sure there's lots of very expensive lawyers that aren't as good as some pro bono lawyers. And while this one does show a stark difference in amount, it doesn't actually have a clear impact on the argument. It is very tempting though. And E, the number of parents with average incomes accused of bribing universities was no greater than the number of wealthy parents accused of doing so. E is like C, except for it works because it's talking about numbers, and our argument is talking about numbers. If the number of parents with average incomes that were accused of bribing universities was like significantly greater than the number of wealthy parents accused of doing so, that would weaken the argument because the conclusion is based solely on the fact that the number of average income parents who were convicted is higher than the number of wealthy parents who were convicted. But if the number of parents with average incomes that were accused was no greater and possibly less than the number of wealthy parents accused, and yet they were still convicted at a significantly higher rate, the conclusion is starting to look more likely. Does that help? We're going with E. Do you have any questions on any of the other ones? This is often a divisive choice. Here to my explanation. Okay, awesome. Let's look at this one. Okay. During the Great Depression, then United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt responded to the economic calamity by instituting a set of programs and regulations known as the New Deal. While ostensibly federal spending on New Deal programs was focused where it was needed, some historians believe that Roosevelt was as interested in buying votes as he was in restoring the country's economy. These historians cite as evidence the fact that a disproportionately large amount of New Deal federal spending went to key states that Roosevelt needed to win in the next election in order to win re election. So, during the Great Depression, FDR responded to the economic calamity through a set of programs and regulations known as the New Deal. A disproportionately large amount of New Deal spending went to key states that FDR needed to win in order to win re election. So, notice the timeline on this. A disproportionately large amount of this spending went to states that he needed to win in the next election. That is why historians believe that FDR was as interested in buying votes as he was in restoring the US economy. This is also a bit milder than some conclusion, so I think that's worth noting. They're not saying he only cares about buying votes, they're just saying he was at least as interested in buying votes for re-election as he was in restoring the US economy. Let's look at our choices. A large amount of New Deal federal spending went to relatively affluent states in which incomes, having dropped, were still higher than those in other states. This doesn't connect to the votes thing. So it feels relevant, but if we're trying to say that he's as interested in buying votes, then we would need to know more about how these states are voting for us to see that impact. B, the high taxes necessary for funding New Deal programs took money from the hands of businesses and consumers, prolonging the period of high unemployment associated with the Great Depression. This is just more information about the New Deal and the Great Depression. It isn't relevant to our conclusion. C, the states whose representatives in the federal government had the greatest seniority received disproportionately large amounts of New Deal federal spending. I think that this one could be fun as a weakener, but it would take some logical leaps. It certainly does not strengthen the argument. It kind of suggests that there could be another thing going on as far as allocating funds. D, New Deal federal spending in states in which overwhelming majorities of people had voted for Roosevelt in the last election was relatively meager. So we know from the argument that states that he needed to win in the next election got a disproportionately large amount of this money. That is evidence for the conclusion. What D says is states that he won in the last election really strongly, in which he had an overwhelming majority of the votes. So states that he probably wouldn't need to court, he's likely to win these states again, got relatively meager amounts of the New Deal money. This strengthens the conclusion because not only is he given money to the states that he needs to win, these sure thing states that he has been such a solid victor in the past, he's not worried about giving them very much money at all. So that kind of supports that he's somewhat interested in buying votes. And E, in many cases, New Deal programs crowded out private enterprise, worsening economic problems rather than solving them. This is also just like some trivia that's a little bit critical of the New Deal in general, but not relevant to our conclusion. So I'm thinking D. Any. Okay. New Deal programs were focused where it was needed, right? So the fact that it went to affluent states does it not strengthen. Where the money is needed, it's kind of a tricky thing to determine based on this. That's why, what choice is that? A, it went to relatively affluent states. So states that are relatively affluent might also be states with more people. Often they are. So relatively affluent based on what? Because a place with more people is more likely to need more help. That's kind of how I see that. We don't really know. There's no reason to think that the fact that these affluent states got money wasn't being fair to like helping the largest amount of people. Um, and that is why that one's just like a little bit vague to work. Okay. Any other questions about this one? Okay. Down. Here is our last one. So these last four are hard difficulty, and the this one's like a challenge difficulty is what I would call it because people average about 30% correct on it. Anything 30% or less I consider like quite challenging. Um, but the last four are hard, and then the first two were medium. To get people who have been reluctant to reduce or eliminate their consumption of meat to move to following plant-based diets, the Magical Meat Company has developed meat-like products that are pea and rice protein based. The company's founders are confident that once Magical Meat's products are widely available, many people who would not otherwise have done so in the short term will make the switch to plant-based diets. Because the difference between the appearance, taste, and feel of Magical Meat's products and those of meat is minimal. Let's break this down. This question has one of my favorite things I like to point out. So, Magical Meat, they've developed these meat-like products that are based on or built around pea and rice protein. The goal of the products is to get people who have been reluctant to reduce or eliminate meat in their diets to move to following a more plant-based diet. And the difference between the appearance, taste, and feel of Magical Meat's products and their meat counterparts is minimal. The conclusion is once Magical Meat's products are widely available, this is a conditional conclusion. Once they are widely available, many people who would not otherwise have done so in the short term will make the switch to plant-based diets. So, let's look at our choices. A, Magical Meat has been able to make its products appear, taste, and feel minimally different from meat because of certain properties of coconut oil and cocoa butter. We don't care how they do it. We know that they do it. That's good enough for us. B, much of the reason why people are reluctant to switch from diets, including meat, to plant-based diets is that they are convinced that all plant-based foods contain inadequate quantities of protein. B is about people's perception. If people are convinced that all plant-based foods contain inadequate quantities of protein, it doesn't matter how good these products are. The conclusion will not come to pass. So, B is a little bit off topic, but I actually think is kind of a solid weakener. C, digestive problems that many people experience after consuming whole peas are not often experienced by people who have consumed pea protein. So, if that wasn't true, and consuming pea protein gave people digestive problems, then it doesn't really matter how good of a meat to do these meat-like products are. Like, if they make people sick, then people probably aren't going to switch over to them. So what this does is it rules out a malicious variable that perhaps the author had not considered by saying, hey, even if sometimes people have digestive issues with peas, that is not true of the form of peas that we are using in this meat-like product. So C is looking good. D, many people who follow plant-based diets prefer Magical Meats products to other similar products. We don't care about those people. They're already following plant-based diets. We're only talking about people that are going to switch to plant-based diets because of how great this meat mimicking product is. And E, because pea protein and rice protein are readily available in great quantities, Magical Meat will be able to produce as much of its products as is necessary to make them widely available. Do you remember what I said about a conditional conclusion? That's already folded into the conclusion. So, would that be helpful? It could have been, except for we are only concluding what will happen once these products are widely available. However, they get them there, that's really their business. We're not concerned about it. Pay close attention to conditional conclusions because if there is a conditional conclusion, there will be a related trap answer that sees if you overlooked the conditional nature of the conclusion. So, best choice is C. This one's pretty hard, so if you felt like it was hard, that's not surprising at all. I just like to have an example so I can demonstrate conditional conclusion traps. And if you have any questions about that one, We can talk about it, or if you have any other questions, it's question time. Ooh, someone did ask me. Mm, mm, mm. I think there was one somewhere. Oh, someone saw my GMAT Ninja session. Yeah, I had never met that guy. He was super nice. Um, did I use just OGs and TTP or any other resources to practice? I just use the mocks and TTP and the other little like study guide that the OG has. I didn't really use anything else. This person is talking about worrying about running out of verbal resources. Here is my advice on that. You want to squeeze everything you can out of every question. So when I go through these and I'm saying, like, hey, here's the problem with this, I think it's worth doing that. I think if you go through and you spend some time like looking for problems with the wrong answers, then the OG and the TTP questions will be so many questions that you just wouldn't even have energy to do anymore. But what sometimes people will do is they'll kind of like rush through them, or they won't try to really drill down and get a super solid understanding, and then they run out of verbal questions because all of them are vaguely familiar. If you if you feel yourself doing that, I just encourage you to kind of take some time, especially to review. Even if you got a question right, like go through and spend some time making sure that you understand why the wrong answers are wrong. And you should have lots of verbal practice questions if you do that. Could you please give some guidance on timing? I seem to be going over time on most questions during the exam and then not having enough time for the last few questions. Yes, I also did that. When you're doing, especially like the mocks, you kind of just have to watch your timing more closely. And I know that that's hard because I also knew how long I was supposed to spend on questions, and yet I would have two or three at the end that I was rushing through. One thing that I think is really important is going through all of the six mocks, because if you're anything like me, it will take you that long to actually like tweak your behavior enough that you can stop being like, oh, well, I can spend 30 extra seconds here. Like, I've almost got this one. You have just got to know when to cut yourself off and move on to the next one. You can also review and change up to three answers, three out of like 23 questions. It's a significant amount of answers that you can change. So, that also helped me be like, you know what, I'm going with this. And if I have time, I'll come back. And I didn't usually have a lot of time on verbal, but at least it makes me give myself a fair shot on those last few questions instead of front loading and then running out of time. And you definitely don't want to leave a question unanswered because it's worse to get a question blank than it is to just get a wrong answer for your score. Um, every question wrong is all the questions given will be really similar with official GMAT. I will say that when I pick the questions that we do in the webinars, I tend to pick questions that students have asked me about before, or that I think warrant some discussion, or I think they illustrate like specific things that are worth noticing. These are kind of hard questions because of that. Because if they were easy, like there would not be a lot of room for discourse, and I try to have a little bit of room for discourse and pointing things out. If you got them all wrong, depending on where you are in your study journey, then hopefully I was pointing some things out that you'll be able to notice in the future and kind of incorporate. If you're really early on, then I definitely wouldn't worry about this. These are harder level questions for the most part. Like I said, that last one is correct less than 30% of the time, I think. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's more supposed to be pointing out things that people often overlook and common trap answers. And when you read through more questions, hopefully that'll save you from some trap answers. Did we have any other questions? I do have a finance background. One thing that I will say is that thank you for the session. I love to do the sessions. One thing I will say is that if you have some sort of quant background, then you are probably super good at the quant that you use. But unless you're like a high school math teacher, you are not going to be good at all of the quant on the test. So I dealt with numbers a lot, and when I was doing like rate problems, when I was doing like interest problems, I didn't really have to review that much, but there was a ton of quant that I had to review, especially like properties of numbers stuff that I hadn't thought about in 15 years. I did not remember that stuff. So, yes, the TTP course helped me a lot brush up on quant. But one thing I would say is like, even if you think you're really good at quant, the GMAT covers so many quant things that it's worth at least glancing over every subject because there might be some that you don't remember at all. And maybe they're not super like practical in day-to-day life, and so you haven't used them in a long time, but that doesn't mean that they won't show up on the GMAT. So it's worth at least glancing over all the things that they're going to cover. Does LSAT CR and RC questions really help? Have read a lot of reviews saying they help. The LSAT is a little bit different than the GMAT in ways that I think are worth noticing. One of them is that they do assumptions a little bit different. They do like the necessary and sufficient assumptions. But one thing that they are all about on the LSAT is logical flaws. And if you learn to spot logical flaws in arguments, critical reasoning gets easier once you see like the obvious flaws that the test writer has planted in the questions. You can kind of get a feel for the sort of answers a little bit better that are going to fit into those gaps. It helps me to think of it as like the person that wrote the passage and the person that wrote the answers is probably the same person. So like what gap did they leave themselves so they could write a solid answer? And I think that the LSAT can teach you, or the LSAT questions, they cover logical flaws a little bit more in depth, and they can teach you there's not that many you have to look out for. But yeah, 5 or 10 logical flaws that will come up repeatedly in critical reasoning. It's worth at least like glancing over those. As far as like the specific types of questions, I would just be a little bit careful that you don't spend time on question types that the GMAT doesn't do. But you can definitely Google the differences and it'll be easy enough to parse them out. There is LSAT stuff, I'm pretty sure, on GMAT Club too, so they might have already filtered out some of those for you. If I can suggest some pointers on boldface and inference types. My pointers, that's an interesting pair. So, I'm a big fan of a breakdown. That's how I like to do it. It just helps me see things a lot more clearly. Um, when you're talking about inference, one of my pointers is that an inference needs to be fully supported, and a choice that's like, oh, it may be the case that this is way easier to fully support than a choice that says it's the case that this. So the softer the choice is how I view it, the easier it is to fully support. If it's like on an inference, if it's like X causes Y because there's some evidence of a causal relationship, that is wrong because you can never prove causation. But if it was like X might cause Y, that is so much easier. The burden of proof is so much lower on a soft statement like that. And you will notice in a lot of inference questions that the answer is kind of soft for that reason so that it can meet the burden of like being fully supported. On boldface, also big fan of breakdowns. One thing that I would also say is a lot of times in the boldface and method of reasoning non-boldface, there is several conclusions. There is like an intermediate conclusion and a final conclusion or a conclusion the author disagrees with. There's so many conclusions going on. Be sure that you're keeping those straight because if you conflate them, there's no way that you are going to get that question right. But if you just take a second to kind of see, like, this sentence supports conclusion A, this sentence supports conclusion B, it it helps to be just like front loading your organization for the structural layout. That will make it much easier to find the right answer. Mm. How much time did it take me to get to this level? It took me a long time. I studied for about 9 or 10 months, and then now I also like explain these questions just for students. So I'm even better than I used to be. And so I think that one lesson from that is that if you take some time and you have a captive audience that has to listen to you, taking some time to try to explain things to people is a good way to see how well you understand them. If you cannot explain them to other people, then maybe like brush up a little bit. It can help kind of dig the trenches in your mind for the knowledge patterns that you need to succeed, I think. So, for sure, if you have small cousins that you can make listen to you or your parents or whatever, your partner, then see if you can subject them to some arguments that you verbally reason your way through. All right. Any other questions? Okay. I over the 9 months, it was about 15 hours a week. That is sometimes more, sometimes less, but about 15 is what I was able to do working full time. If you aren't working or your job is like pretty chill, then you could probably do more, but I wouldn't say don't try to make yourself do 30 hours a week if you don't have 30 hours a week in you because you're not going to get the benefits and it's just going to make you burn out. So, really, just like you want to push yourself at a growth level. You don't want to push yourself past the point of like being able to really spend time with the material and absorb it and get something out of studying. It's a delicate balance. Pay attention and hopefully you can kind of figure out what your own limits are with some practice. I'm going to put my email here in case anyone thinks of any other questions. And then I think that one person had wanted the recording. So if you want to email me, then I can send it to you. And it does take like a couple of days, I think, to process. So we can see how long it takes, but I can set myself a reminder. And if you'll just email me, I can email it right back to you. If there is no other questions, then we can wrap